One of America's most incredible national parks sits on the border of Montana and Canada. It's called Glacier National Park. Giant cliffs of sedimentary rock rise thousands of feet high.
How did the rocks form? And what processes carved these giant valleys?
Secular scientists say these rocks are over 1.6 billion years old and contain stromatolites, built by microbes supposed to have formed over 1 billion years ago, according to evolution. They also say many ice ages over millions of years carved these valleys.
Yet, there are over 60 ideas about how the Ice Age formed and melted, showing secular scientists really don't have any one theory that works well with the evidence.
Some people doubt there was an ice age, but the evidence is all around us. The Bible indicates that these rocks were formed quickly during the global flood, which produced the right conditions for one ice age, all happening within the last 4,350 years. This timescale does not match with the billions of years proposed by secular scientists.
Which view is correct? And what does the evidence really show? Find out all this and more next on Awesome Science.
Awesome Science takes you on a field trip to some of the most amazing geologic and historic sites around the world, where we use the Bible as our history guidebook to interpret what we see, that the Bible can be trusted, and empirical science falls in line with the biblical account of creation, the fall, and the flood. Science, it's awesome. Because the fossils in the top layer appear to be more simple than the fossils in the bottom layer. If evolution were true, then we should find the opposite and more basic life forms on the bottom.
Secular scientists promote the idea of an overthrust to explain why the fossils are out of order. The overthrust becomes their magic bullet to solve this dilemma. But as we pointed out, there is no evidence for an overthrust happening over millions of years. So how do we solve this problem? The Bible provides the answer to this dilemma. The key to understanding how the rocks in Glacier were formed, and much of the Rockies, is found in the composition of their formations. They are mostly sedimentary rocks, which are formed by water and underwater. The lower layers are granite and metamorphic rocks, which could possibly be the rocks of creation.
The Bible says that about 4,350 years ago, man had come to a point where every thought of his mind was evil, and God was sorry that he made man. So he chose to destroy everything on the earth by water as a judgment against man's rebellion and sin. But there was one righteous man, Noah, along with his family, who God chose to save by warning him of the coming disaster, and that he must build an ark to be saved.
When the flood came, it was catastrophic. As promised, all life on earth was destroyed. After 150 days, the water covered the entire earth. The earth was going through tremendous geologic turmoil below the surface of the water.
Giant tidal currents carried sand, silt, and mud across the globe, laying down many layers of sediment, in some places tens of thousands of feet thick. As water currents changed because of the geologic activity below, life forms were being buried in massive graves right within the soft sedimentary layers.
As the flood reached its full height, the earth below began to rise in places as rock layers were pushed up, developing large mountains, which changed the worldwide flood currents.
As mountains rose, the floodwaters began to fall away from the uplifting rock layers, first flowing in sheets, eroding thousands of feet of layers of soft sediment and depositing them into new ocean basins and elsewhere on the continents. Because of this rise of the mountains on the continents, entire layers of sediment miles wide could also have began sliding downhill by the simple force of gravity. Back in the 1950s, secular scientists proposed the idea of gravity slides to explain these out-of-place layers. But then, in the 1960s, those scientists changed to believe that slow plate tectonics caused these features, because they like to believe in slow, gradual processes. They choose to ignore the data, which supported gravity slides. But creation scientists have brought back the idea of catastrophic gravity slides, or superfaults, to explain how these massive layers of rock were put into place.
First of all, as we established, solid rock cannot easily be pushed. It breaks apart when moved. In order for these layers to move and stay together, unbroken, they would have to be relatively soft at the time they were moved.
There were only 2 times in history where these layers could have been relatively soft, during the creation week and during the flood. Since these layers in Glacier are upper layers, they're from the time of the flood. During the flood, water could have been trapped under some of the sediment layers. This water would have been under tremendous pressure.
Studies have shown that if a sediment layer is tilted at least 2 degrees and there is water under high pressure underneath this layer, the layer will begin to slide downhill due to gravity.
The process of compressed water making heavy objects slide is similar to waterboarding at the beach. Waterboarding is taking a thin board, throwing it across a thin sheet of water, then running and sliding on top of it. If you tried waterboarding on dry sand, it would be disastrous. But when a thin layer of water is put between the board and the sand, with the pressure of you on top, you can glide for many feet.
When the mountains were rising at the end stages of the flood, layers of sediment would have glided across the landscape in a similar way. After the layers stopped sliding and settled down, the rock layers further hardened.
Sediment layers from the beginning of the flood, which contained the earliest buried animals, would have been put on top of layers that had fossils which died later in the flood. It would appear that they are out of place.
Another creationist discovery for the quick superfaulting of these layers is a thin layer of metamorphic silicate glass found between the layers. This glass can only be formed by frictional melting with temperatures exceeding 1,000 degrees Celsius.
It is believed that this glass can only occur with high-speed movement between rock layers. Evidence for slow-moving rock layers has already been shown to be impossible. But this glass points clearly to a catastrophic process going on during the time of the flood.
In its truest sense, the formation here at Glacier was an overthrust, only it happened catastrophically, in just days below the waters. Geologically speaking, this is called gravity tectonics.
Other overthrusts around the world would have been forming around the same time. In fact, when one gravity slide happens, it triggers others around the same area. And suddenly, you have a catastrophic domino effect happening under the floodwaters. Eventually, the floodwaters became less. Instead of sheet erosion, the water channelized, eroding large valleys, such as seen at Glacier. Eventually, all water emptied into the oceans. Additional erosion and massive settling of the Earth's surface continued after the flood, carving out these valleys even more.
Even though we don't yet understand all the details about the geologic processes happening during the global flood, the biblical model makes much more sense of what we find in the mountain formations around the world. Science, it's awesome.